Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar of 2021, hosted by Head of Design here at Nomensa, Will Wellesley-Davies. Today's webinar, Nature or Nurture, How to Design Meaningful Conversations. Will's going to discuss our natural conversational instincts and how to design for them. Also, how design and technology are together nurturing us to adapt and evolve our conversation expectations, and the future role of machines in supporting conversations with our customers. As always, do join in the discussion in the chat. Make sure your settings are switched to panelists and attendees, just so everyone can see your messages. And if you've got any questions for Will, please submit them using the Q&A function, and I'll get through as many as I can at the end. Finally, unfortunately, we're having some issues with our captioning software for this webinar. I apologise if you are affected by this. We'll ensure captions are provided when the webinar is publicly available on our YouTube channel, which should be before the end of the week or early next week. So yeah, without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Will.
Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar and showing your interest in conversation design and this sort of rainy afternoon. So in some ways, thank goodness we don't have to travel at this time. Conversation design is quite an exciting area. I think it sort of feels like it's an emerging space, and it's central to sort of how we build our relationships with customers, how we connect and then maintain and retain our customers. But conversation design, although it feels like a new thing, we're sort of building it iteratively on sort of previous sort of tried and tested ideas and evolving them into the sort of technologies we're beginning to embrace in the way we work and communicate people with today. So I started my career back at the BBC about 25 years ago now. Makes me feel very old. And at that time I was looking at helping design websites with information and interactions that would engage and entertain, and then sort of integrate with TV programs that were happening at the time. And since then, I've sort of built out my career looking to work with all sorts of industries in digital design consultancies to help businesses understand how to design better digital experiences. And I think what I found is central to all of these is a way of designing more meaningful conversations in those sort of interactions. So my first slide says hello, which, if you think about it, is the way we start all conversations. It's the most common sort of method of welcome. It's a common ground, which is an essential ingredient to starting a good conversation. And this isn't just any old hello. I mean, for all the Mac fans out there, this is actually a hello that was developed and designed by Susan Kare, who was the designer behind the first sort of interface that Apple used on the Apple Macintosh back in the 80s. Here it is. It probably holds the same price now as it did then. But the reason why Apple used it, because they wanted to challenge people's perceptions of how and what computers are and how they play a part in the home environment. And what we found is this is an example of what we say often means more than what is literally said. So Apple were trying to imply that by getting an Apple, you could bring technology into your home that is more accessible, that's simpler, it's more friendly. They're inviting us to learn more and try out this new concept of sort of home computing. Now, if we zoom forward 40 years, which is quite incredible, you can begin to see that we've built up a huge plethora of technology that is embedded into the way we live our lives. Technology is fully pervasive. We can now contact, talk to each other in any location, any situation. Our devices are more intelligent. They want to talk with us, and in some cases they want to talk for us. Now, our technology and the way we use them in our conversations help us think, they help us socialize, they help us do everything in our lives, you know, from shopping, managing our lives, checking the weather, to ordering food. Tech is now actually, for the younger generations, becoming an extension of us. The younger generations are thinking to take away a phone, be sort of taking away a part of them. It becomes absolutely embedded in how we converse and talk with each other. So let's step back and think what makes good or bad conversations. We've all experienced them. We're all familiar with them. It's all actually quite a natural kind of skill that we have. And so it's worth stepping back and thinking about some of that behavioural science that sort of guides the way we converse with each other. Now, behavioural science is really a combination of social and cultural sort of anthropology, psychology, and some of the behavioural aspects of our biology, the sort of economics as well. It's a sort of a rich tapestry of information that can give us insight into understanding how we use language to talk to each other and achieve the things we want to achieve. So in our title, I talked about nurture and nature, or nature and nurture, sort of which one comes first. Nature we tend to relate to our human qualities, those sort of behavioural aspects of our biology. They're really what our instincts are based on. Often these sort of reactive capabilities are things that happen in a subconscious way, almost as if we're not really thinking about it, they just happen, we just respond to them. Whilst nurture refers to sort of things that we're sort of influenced by the things around us. We tend to think about, you know, the way we're parented, the way we're brought up, educated. It's informed by the people we hang out with, our communities, cohorts. And so it relates to our demographics, our cultures. We put those into practice, we start to sort of question things. So, you know, if we received a message saying you're awesome, it can be funny or it could be rude. You know, we have to understand the context. What is someone implying by presenting that communication? It starts to play on is that our nature, our nurture, that's sort of informing our decision. Is this picture a sort of symptom of some training, or is it sort of natural instinct? Again, it's sort of beginning to get us to start thinking about which of these factors are playing a part. So when we think of nature and the way we converse, we actually use all our senses. They're a complex combination of inputs that feed the way we read a situation. I always find it fascinating when we hear things, actually our body, our natural instincts are beginning to read the intonations of your voice, the way it echoes, the size of the space you're sitting in, the kind of direction, the volume, all feed into subtle ways to think about how is this message being presented. And when we think of the other senses of smell, of taste, of touch, sight, we combine all of these to inform how we read the world around us. And so when it comes to conversation, they play a powerful part in the way we interpret the information and sense how to respond to the person in front of us. And it's quite amazing to think that I think 95% of our sensory read is subconscious. They're kind of happening all the time without us really thinking about it. And we combine these inputs into memories. We have the ability to store information, make meaning of it, record that meaning, and start to make those connections in our memory that create an intelligence. They create an ability for us to take learnt, lived experiences and then use them to inform our later lives. And the more we have of them, the more we can apply them, the more subtle things we can kind of cope with. If we think about putting that into practice, just think about ordering a sandwich. We have a conversation with the person at the sort of till at the sandwich makers, and we'll put in our order, but we're surrounded by noise, by people, by things going on, other activities, and we tend to use these senses in quite a clever way. We have selected hearing. You know, we're not listening to the conversation behind us, we're listening to the person in front of us. We have eye gaze. If the person making the sandwich is distracted by someone, we can see this is happening. We use body language, intonation, little pauses. All of these build a kind of context to how we respond in our conversation to order our sandwich. And we see some of this in some of the entertainment we all enjoy. You know, conversation can often be seen more of an art form than a scientific form. If you think about the host of David Letterman, he is an example of a kind of master conversationalist. And we know really that it's a TV production show. It's designed for our entertainment as a viewer. But an interesting part, aspect of it is they'll have researchers that will inform them all the information about their guests, try and understand the sort of story, and they'll craft the structure of that interview so that we can go on this meandering journey and as if it's by accident learn these wonderful insights to entertain us, all of which has been crafted and structured and planned. And so it gives us an indication that we can design conversations when we understand what those triggers work. You know, in these kind of conversational situations and chat shows, we often see these little aspects of behavioral responses. We see people mimicking physical kind of positioning. We look at emotive responses and prompts. We see topics being picked up and shared. We see topics divert and switch, we can sometimes see those techniques in play. And when we think of play, we tend to think of that like a bit like a dance. And this is an artist I'd like to introduce you to called Stefanie Posavec. She was a digital artist, or is a digital artist based in London, and she specializes in turning data and information into new kind of presentations, new visual representations to help us make better sense of it. And she took a residency at Facebook back in 2013 and started to look at their social media platform and explore how that data is creating patterns. And what she did is she started looking at how couples would interact on the Facebook platform, looking at what information they shared, where they liked things, where they posted it, who they shared it with, and started to present it in the form of dance steps. And it creates this really quite interesting series of patterns. We can begin to see there's lots of sort of quite literally sort of mental movements between how two people interact, where you have these little flurries, side steps, and it brings to life some of the logics and principles that we use in the way we talk to each other. So conversations leave in a way a pattern of data, and with that data we can start to see logics. We can see that they're requesting something, promising something, they're beginning to counter an opinion, they withdraw, they accept. And therefore we have these kind of movements between two people, these principles that start to sort of surface and start to give us some indication of what are the techniques we're using. This is Paul Grice, quite a poignant picture. And Paul Grice was a philosopher and linguist, and he's from Birmingham originally, but ended up at Berkeley, California, studying how we use conversation and language in how humans communicate with each other. And he developed a principle called the cooperative principles. What he realized was that as we talk to each other, there are a number of assumptions that we begin to make of the person we're talking with. These assumptions are a sense of cooperation. They're around quality, quantity, relation, and manner. And that these four key principles are some of the basic assumptions that help us cooperate. And it's cooperation that is required for us to then have a conversation. So if we look at each one of those, so if we look at quality, in a conversation context, quality, we need to understand, we need to make sure that we make information true. We tend to make the assumption that when people talk to us, they are giving us truth. And that when we listen to people, we assume they're telling us the truth. It's a two-way thing. And therefore, we also want to, when we're crafting conversation, look to use evidence in the way we then respond. And so if someone gives you one truth, we then build on that truth to then respond back to them. The second rule, it was quantity. So this is about how much information we give to people that is required. It's about a kind of brevity of information for the moment. If you imagine someone running for the train and they're asking when the next train is, they're not looking for a sit down half-an-hour conversation. They want the shortest amount of information that helps them get to that train on time. It's about creating the right information for the right moment. We also look at relation. So this is about being relevant. So it's about being relevant to a topic, focusing on one thing at a time. Often in a conversation, if one side starts overloading information, in a sales conversation, they're overselling, tend to lose people. People begin to not be able to cope with all that information and they tend to pull away. But if we can keep it relevant to the information received and relevant to the quality, we can begin to get that cooperation working. And the fourth is manner. So perspicious is a very odd word in this context because it becomes so complicated as a word that most people aren't actually familiar with. But really, this is about simplifying what you say, making it as clear as possible, and trying to make it in an ordered way so that people clearly can memorize and understand and contribute and feedback. So when we pull all those four back together, we can begin to appreciate that if we can follow these principles, then it will allow the other party in your conversation to sort of respond equally. And we can build a momentum to that conversation. And it's interesting, if you take those same rules, but then break them, they can become quite entertaining. And I think everyone might remember this, but in the Pink Panther Returns is a sort of 70s classic. There's a wonderful scene where Inspector Clouseau sees a dog and sort of turns to the hotelier and says, "Does your dog bite?" I think I spit my words out. And comically, the hotelier says no. And when he turns to the dog bites him. And of course he says, "I thought he says your dog doesn't bite." He then responds, "That's not my dog." And this is a kind of clear kind of breach of one of those rules, where the relevance has been ignored. Clearly, the man at the till can tell what the situation is, but he's decided to break that rule. And in this context, it's funny. But in the real world, you can see that can be quite annoying. It can be quite insulting. So it begins to show that if we break those rules, it can work to our favor or not. And we have to be aware of how these rules are working within the way we make our conversations. So it's easy to see where things can go wrong. And it's interesting when we take conversations from face to face into a more digital context, we can begin to see actually when we look at those senses we tend to rely on, quite a lot of them are going to be reduced. I can't smell through the digital kind of ether. I can't quite see all the context that people are in. And therefore, it can be quite difficult to understand what's influencing people's sort of conversation and therefore what they're implying. We can kind of, it's a bit like putting one hand behind your back and trying to catch. It begin to limit. But actually, as we're evolving and building closer relationships, we're beginning to learn to compensate for that. If we go back to our example of ordering a sandwich, of course, we can do that in a digital world now. But it's interesting when we think about them side by side, we start to think, but what if I have a question about that filling? What if that information isn't there? And I always think it's interesting in a digital context, often, especially on a mobile, we're beginning to feel a much more one-to-one situation. So if I've got Deliveroo and I'm trying to order a sandwich, it's almost as if they're only talking to me and I've only got that information to work with. But as soon as I had a problem, I feel it's a limited service. And we're beginning to see actually how other services are beginning to sort of augment and work together. So you might end up with an assistant beginning to help you talk with that company and go via another channel. And so we're beginning to see how these sort of siloed examples of conversations in different types of situations are beginning to blur. When we look at our lives across all these channels, we're saying that we've fundamentally changed and integrated quite a complex mesh of sort of continuous conversations into the way we live our lives. We have conversations that retain, they stop, they start, they sort of jump in flurries. They're kind of persistent in the background. They're kind of journeys where we can start on a smart speaker that might update our mobile, that might take us to a website. And so each of us with our different lived experiences will start to use kind of devices in different ways, but still expect our conversations to stream across them in a kind of seamless way. Now, when I talk about each of us are all slightly different. And when I look at my own family, I've got 2 teenage kids, and actually this picture isn't that distant from our kind of breakfast scene. Different generations are beginning to learn how to use technology in different ways. They're nurtured differently. And therefore, we're each introduced to different types of technologies, and we learn at different ages how to sort of make best use of them. And that's both in terms of how we use them to read, to write, to kind of to listen. And I remember my kids when they were very young, instead of typing, they would just use the voice record because that was easier than typing, partly because they probably couldn't spell. So when we start to look at the different generations and start to see where they've been introduced to sort of some of these digital technologies and the way we use them in our social interactions, we can begin to see there are bigger and bigger differences. And we can begin to understand actually how different people's expectations vary. If you take, I sit in the Generation X kind of world, we're a world where, yes, we've been brought up with a lot of technology, go back to my Apple references, but actually we still have lots of references to the phone, to the post, to printed brochures. We have more references across more media that we're kind of relating to, and therefore our expectations are different to a Generation Z we call the Zoomers now, who have been born with practically a mobile phone in their hand. Therefore, their whole premise of what they set out as their expectations and what they expect of conversations across these channels are completely different. They're what we call digital natives. And therefore, it is not unreasonable that their relative impatience and expectations are going to be challenging for us when we think about how to join up conversations. Of course, the last three sort of generations that we just looked at have been consumed by social media. Social is a platform for conversation. This has driven our sort of endless sort of almost addiction to having our fingers sort of swiping down to see what the next step of our conversation is. It has helped us share and socialize conversations, bring people in, join conversations, close conversations. And we've learned how to augment these kind of conversations into our wider life. And therefore, it becomes a big step change into how we then approach designing conversations. Conversations help us make decisions. When we join up the value of these conversations, we begin to think we build confidences, we can build trust, and we can then have a more informed position to make a decision. That's a kind of case which we can begin to find ways to build that conversation and those confidence points through different people. You know, I might talk to my family, I might talk to experts, I might talk to all sorts of reference points to inform my decision, and all that's sort of been held in my personal user kind of goals as to what I want to achieve. And someone looking at exploring this area is a lady called Alison Wood Brooks from Harvard. And she has been developing a program of work called How to Talk Gooder in Business and Life. And it's about trying to sort of see how can we learn to influence the way conversations play out and drive them towards kind of business goals. And she's developed a series of rules that have built upon Paul Grice's rules developed back in the 70s, and to sort of look at how we can apply those rules, evolve them to start to help us address some of these challenges of our conversations that spread across the different types of digital channels we now kind of live amongst. What she's identified is when we have conversations, they're made up of lots of micro decisions. Each of those can have outcomes. You know, sometimes they can be a means to an end or an end to themselves. They could be just entertainment. Each of these sort of conversations can have influences that begin to change and have an influence on the trajectories of our relationships. You know, they begin to start to define boundaries. They put us into different cohorts or communities. And if you think about that with a kind of example of buying a car, we don't tend to go to the shop and come home with a car. We tend to think about it a long, long way before, and we start to make lots of small incremental decisions. What size, what kind of brand, what kind of color, what's the performance? We need to think about the capability, the affordability, and how am I going to pay for it? All of these begin to build little different types of decision points in our conversations. And each of those in turn will build our confidences to help sort of build a kind of sense of inclusiveness when we're trying to make decisions with a family, let's say. So the maxims that Alison's brought up are called T.A.L.K. So it's 4 topics, 4 sort of categories to it, sorry. The first is topic. So it's about having a topic that people can engage with. So it's about being prepared, and then allows us to start understanding how we manage the conversation. So it's about helping us select and sort of shift topics. So if we start talking about something I don't understand, then we have to be clear about that. If it's something I really understand, I can kind of extend it. And topics help us helps with the engagement in our conversation. But if we have a topic that we're not sure about, we might then think about asking to see whether we can move to a different topic. Maybe we can learn about that topic, or maybe we can make a switch and suggest a different topic, but we do it through the process of asking. And that kind of gives us the ability to start to control and to start to influence how a conversation works, instead of letting it sort of peter out. And with that, we then add levity. So this is about sort of appropriate sort of moments of humor, beginning to bring playfulness, a sort of human quality into it, so that it is sort of light and enjoyable. And then in a kind of reactive and reflective mode, we introduce kindness. And so this is about sort of using empathy to sort of build investment into those sort of conversations. And so we sort of, if we have opposing views, we respond, we show listening, kind of responsive listening. We reflect away from conversation. We begin to build that sort of understanding of how to look at the conversation and sort of just be immersed in it. And so these maxims help us start to look at how we can influence those conversations and build and accumulate a way of helping guide conversations actually across channels. You know, if we can begin to guide a conversation from a smart speaker to then arrive on a website that then can then fill in information through a chatbot, we can begin to see how these sort of journeys can join up. And we can craft conversations that both engage customers, we can help them learn and understand and make kind of positive and informed decisions. And with each small step, we can build more trusting kind of relationships with customers. Now, it helps in these sort of things when we sort of step back, it helps to sort of map out how our conversations are working across channels. And it made me think about sort of platforms in terms of communications platforms, comms channels. But then I was thinking like platform games. And I was thinking, I wonder if we could look at how that as a metaphor to help gives us a way of understanding some of the challenges we have. So when we map out customer journeys, we tend to look at them across channels. We begin to look and identify where they're causing issues, where are those pain points. And actually, when we're looking to design conversations that can switch between channels, we want to see what are the other channels' capabilities and where is the right time to help them switch across. So here in my little made up Donkey Kong world, I was thinking about how we could represent a couple of channels just as an example. Often we have, let's say, a phone kind of call center, but we might find it takes too long to meet expectations to support a customer, but we might be able to offer them a way to switch over to a web channel. But when we arrive at the web channel, is the web channel aware that I've just come from a kind of phone call? It depends on the platform. But this is where we can begin to sort of identify kind of breaks and gaps in the way our channels and our service kind of works. Where does our conversation just trip over and falter? And if we can identify some of those gaps, we can begin to explore how can we fill those gaps? How can we make the channels aware of each other and the conversations they're having? And how can we bridge those conversations in a more natural and seamless way? And this is where a lot of the time automated services and chatbots can become really powerful. They can not only work across different time zones when people don't really want to work, but they can begin to pick up the information they can have and work in a sort of specialist way to help build and join up some of those conversations. But, you know, chatbots have limitations. They're not brilliant at empathy. And so in different user situations, we need to be careful about how we integrate them into the way we manage conversations. So when it comes to designing better conversations, what we need to do is be thinking about how to build better teamwork. I think what I found is working with different companies is, you know, it is teamwork and how we operate behind the scenes to manage conversations across channels. That's where we need to start with the teamwork and join them up so that a voice channel is aware of what a digital channel is and they have the same standards and understandings of what they want to achieve, so that when you do switch from one to the other, it's much more easy to sort of take on board. I think it's another interesting area with chatbots and the sort of evolution of them is chatbots bring special qualities. If we compare them to humans, that they may be a bit rubbish at emotions, but they are brilliant at calculating and brilliant at reading and finding information. And so if we can identify them for a role and give them clear kind of parameters to what that role is trying to achieve, they can contribute and support great conversations. But they also need to be aware of what they're not good at. And in all job descriptions, we need to sort of put rules in place so that they can identify, oh, that's slightly out of my comfort zone. I think I need to hand you over to someone else. And so it's important that we bring things like these sort of automated machine learning kind of chatbots into the equation of the team and make sure that we understand how everybody supports each other as a team to support better conversations across channels. And of course, if we can do that, we can begin to build a team that also can record and listen to users more acutely, begin to learn from the information they give us. And if we take a nudge to look at the future, we need to look at the next sort of emerging generations and sort of look at where they're coming from their perspectives in terms of their expectations. The Generation Y, the millennial, the Zoomers, they have new and far more kind of creative expectations for what digital can do, but equally with conversation. They've been brought up immersed in social platforms, and they have much more social kind of equity in terms of the future, but also in terms of their needs. When we think about the next generation and how they've been brought up on social media, we realize they are much more digitally native. They're always community connected. They're much more inclusive in the way they think and things they believe in. And in this way, we need to sort of think about how do we support them, have the right dialogue, the right access to brands. And I think this is a big shift change, certainly from my generation and ones before, in terms of recognizing that whilst people of the Generation X and before used to have brands on a big sell and would accept it, brands need to live and breathe, and they present an opportunity for conversation and continual conversation. And actually, for the newer generations, it's more about like a conversational access to those brands to help kind of sustain the value that they provide. So, and I kind of sum up where we are with designing more meaningful conversations. We need to understand the balance of what nature and nurture feeds the conversation. You know, we can't actually do it with one or the other. It is a combination of those, that it's understanding how they influence our conversations and how much weight we put on them. We need, when we look at designing frameworks, designing conversations, we need to support them with frameworks and principles that can guide across channels. It's not just about one channel has different rules to another. We need overarching principles so that when we can switch and evolve to go from a WhatsApp channel to a website to a call center, we can begin to have a much more seamless journey. We need to listen. As always, in good conversations, we need to listen to customers, listen to what they're expecting and what they want, and start to learn and refer to it in ways to evidence how we can kind of improve our understanding and improve the way we can respond to them. We need to adapt our conversations clearly to different types of people, different types of users, but different generations. As we can see, different generations have very different expectations. And actually, through conversation, we can learn who people are if we take the time to ask. And again, if we meet people face to face, the best people that converse with people are the people that ask some of those personal questions to find out who they are, what they're about. And then with that, they build a better sense of sort of friendship. And from that, you can then build on that kind of conversation. Now, I'm sure people don't really want to be friends with every business, but there is an element of learning how to use some of those techniques to build a better understanding of their needs, and then be able to align ourselves to better adapt how we then talk to them. We then need to join up our channels. Quite a lot of channels work brilliantly in isolation, but when we join them up, they start creating some uncomfortable experiences. We then need to build on that and think about the flow between those channels and see where we can kind of help demonstrate the right kind of service with the right kind of conversation. And as I said, working as a team across all sort of experienced teams is so important. And I think we need to include chatbots as if they're a member of that team too, so we can begin to learn from each other's interactions and kind of inform and improve the standards of that conversation. So that's my talk. So thank you very much for listening, and let's have a conversation. And I wonder if everyone's got any questions.
Awesome, thanks, Will. That was great. I love what you said about context and kind of translating conversational context into digital channels. I mean, it's so true. I mean, using digital channels to have a conversation, you know, it's difficult to know what's implied or the context. And I'm sure kind of everyone watching this has probably read a message or received an email that's perhaps been misinterpreted, whereas if the conversation was had face to face, you know, you wouldn't have the same issue at all. And it's
difficult for us to know what to expect. So I think it's always a two-way thing. I think it's how do you set out those expectations? How do you try and then deliver on the expectations you set out?
Yeah, exactly. And the challenge of kind of, of delivery kind of that context and kind of that interpretability into digital channels is, is huge. If anyone does have any questions, please do submit them using the Q&A box. I know that is a couple in the chat, which I'll get to in a minute. Well, I'd love to know kind of, just a bit more about kind of how this kind of relates to the work you do personally.
Yeah, I think, in my role, been working with companies who are often trying to improve, or what I found interesting as a sort of more of a consultant role now, working with companies to sort of understand the balance between business needs and customer needs, and we often talk about customer-centric kind of approaches. But it's often trying to think, well, a company will often look at trying to say, I can't support that channel in that way for every single customer. So it's trying to balance these sort of services, but then, like I said, manage that expectation. And so actually, if you cannot support someone on a particular phone center or call center in a particular way, then maybe it's trying to look at how to raise the value of some of the other channels and then put it into customer-centric points of view. So we're doing some interesting work with some large insurance companies, and if you think about it, this is an area where what's interesting is people don't want to talk about it really. But what they want to talk about is, I just want to make sure I'm safe. I want to make sure if something goes wrong, I've got the right things in place. And so it's actually beginning to learn where are those pressure points of really important conversations where almost I don't want to have them, but I'm going to. Can we make them feel easier? And to take away the pressure of those situations, where they're looking and exploring the sort of end-to-end journey and saying, well, where can we introduce new points to have conversations that are easier, much, much easier, and begin to sort of inform those difficult conversations that we don't want to have. And I think that's what I find really interesting, is trying to sort of look at often service design, look at sort of how businesses interact with their customers, and think about what are the conversations that customers are having in their heads, what are the conversations businesses are having, and then when they collide, where the problems are, how can we try and avoid that problem? And often it is a conversation solution. It's about sort of content design. And so, is information on a website written in a way that engages with those conversations that customers have? How does it extend to have a conversation with customers so that they can start to sort of address those needs for their personal situation? So insurance, for example, is, I've got a garage, I've got a driveway. So does it change anything? What if I go on holiday for 6 weeks? And it's about how do you have those conversations, but also support it sort of efficiently as a business.
Awesome, thanks, Phil. So we've got a few more questions here. So we've got one from Christopher here. Christopher asks, what positions and specialists are needed to implement this within a business?
A great question. Well, I talked about teamwork earlier, but I think when we look at the kind of skill sets we're looking at, and content design is a clear one. Often, content design is a sort of emerging, feels like an emerging area, but it's really about how content works across different channels. And sort of how do we make sure that the content is understood? It's about the cognition that people do understand at the right points this information, and it builds understanding. So content design is a key factor. But equally, it's also about structure of information, so architecture, so information architecture. So typically when we look at a kind of broad service, we're looking at information architecture and content design to play key roles. And then within that, you need interaction designers to sort of work together in that kind of multidiscipline way to see how can we then take good content design and good architecture, but actually make it workable. We need to sort of turn that into reality. And I think within interaction design, you also need, I think graphic design is still a valid, very prominent skill set to sort of begin to, how do we help information be just easier to consume? I think conversation is this sort of thread that holds it together, but we can kind of present it in different ways. A key area I'm interested to sort of influence more and more is just when things like chatbot turn up. We seem to sort of follow this kind of predictable kind of look and feel, like sort of start in sometimes quite clumsy kind of way. And I kind of want to kind of integrate that in a new way. So I think you do need a range of skills to bring to life the aspects of these, and in a way demonstrate it in different ways. So you know, in Numenta we always want to sort of follow up and push designs through sort of evidence, through sort of using user research, listen to what customers say, and then use that evidence to sort of inform and direct your travel of design. And so I think you do need a healthy balance of sort of good research understanding, kind of content architecture, content design, and interaction design that can begin to kind of move from that strategic place into sort of more tactical work.
Brilliant, thanks, Will. So we have a question here from John. John asks, can we think of payments as conversations? We think of payments as a narrow transaction, amount X sent from payer A to payer B for amount Y for good Z, for example. But thinking of it as a conversation allows for more variability, kind of, for example, will I tip, will I satisfy, do I trust this? Do you kind of agree with that, Will?
I absolutely do. I mean, I think this is a case in hand where banks tend to, let's say a bank or a kind of financial institutions have been often reactive and quite transactional in their relationship. It's sort of it's a sort of function rather than a service with a capital S. And I think as soon as you move things into quality of service, you need to sort of apply a layer of conversation to sort of demonstrate that quality. You know, if I go to, and again, this comes back to our references of quality and so on. If I go to a branch and meet the bank manager sort of thing, I would expect him to be polite. I'd expect him to consider my situation, read me as a person in my context, and give me the right kind of advice. Just because we're in digital channels, that doesn't really go out the window. It shouldn't. And so I think absolutely where a bank is trying to provide a service to keep you updated with your money and your financial status, and that's impacted with transactions going in and out, there are consequences. You know, money's gone out. Have I got enough money left for something else? And therefore, I think it's an easy win for a lot of businesses if they take the opportunity to strengthen the value of their services by adding that layer of conversation, so that messages are less functional. And I think at the start of my talk, I talked about how, you know, we can say things that have literal meaning, but what do we imply with them? And that can work positive and negatively. So we can, using brevity, say very little in a transactional way, but actually can leave out a whole bunch of politeness and sort of empathy and service. So I agree. I think we should be thinking about those micro moments. And I think we can begin to apply conversation in a much more applied way. And especially thinking, one of the clients we're working with is, we're working in partnership with a big chatbot company that produce lots of different types of integrated AI. And one of the opportunities we've been looking at is using things like chatbots, but for much more kind of focused micro tasks. So like filling in a form, you know, what does that field mean? And instead of having to sort of labor through where the help text is, a chatbot could help you just fill in a form and do simple little tasks. So little bits of conversation design, I think, absolutely can make better value of tiny moments.
Thanks, Will. So we've got a couple of questions here from Stephen, who asks, is the expectation that digital conversations should be more informal regardless of the subject? And then kind of caveats that with kind of obviously like, obviously excluding kind of traumatic events like death, for example.
Well, I think, yeah, that's a really interesting area to think about. And I think conversations need to reflect context. And yes, you have extremes, but in between your extremes is every shade of gray. And I think customers will be expecting the right kind of, the right tone to meet the same need. And I mean, a classic in UX design was always about sort of, you know, that kind of case of, you know, if you delay a flight, you know, well, what's the impact of it and how do you then respond to it? And I think it's a difficult one because it varies for everybody. Different personalities will respond to things differently. So, but I do think with different businesses, thinking about the service you offer, you need to sort of judge and be aware of the types of needs they're going to have. And I think this is where, when we talk about listening, and often that can sort of move into sort of capturing better senses of data and better sources of data. So one of the areas of research that I always find surfaces really interesting insights is sort of social listening, where we set up dashboards to sort of check what are the key words coming through, what are the tone and sentiment of feedback on this channel compared to other channels. And sometimes you can find that some channels are more honest, more open than others. You know, some might feel more formal. So you can start to bend kind of stats to suit your needs sometimes, but when you blend them, you get a bit more of a real sense of it. I think there is probably a more casual nature with some conversations across digital channels. I think because it's more frequent, more accessible, more open, it can feel more casual. But I think that moves with the sort of sensitivities of our users as well. So I think we've got to judge that one carefully.
Thanks, Will. So we've got one more question here from Stephen again, who just asks, can you give examples of digital conversations, like is interacting with a homepage a conversation, for example?
Absolutely. I think this is it. I think every time we engage with a touch point, there is an opportunity for a conversation. So if I'm looking for, you know, I don't know, if I was looking for a car, as an example I used, you know, you might go to a website and start to say, well, these are the car on offer, but that website is having a conversation with you. It's kind of trying to share, where do you want to start your journey? It's trying to find out some of those requirements to sort of think, well, how can I then surface the right information to you? When we think of navigating through a website, you know, that is part of a conversation. It's part of that response to information. And often, you know, web content struggles sometimes because it sort of forgets. I think sometimes you write something just to put information on a page, it can be harder to then consume than if you put information in a format to have that conversation. And so people can begin to scan it more quickly, tune into the right information and gain that value. I think where the opportunities are is we've learned to try and do that in these siloed channels. So it might be you have, I mean, a company I was working with was sort of saying, well, we send out text messages, you know, we'll sort of, oh, your package is going to arrive, and then you get a text message, you think, but if I disagree with this or don't understand it, I don't know what to do now. I don't have any more information. And so often when we look at how messaging and information is provided to people and how people are looking at and assessing whether people understand it and what the reaction and responses could be, they begin to think, oh, actually, I think this does open up a conversation. I wonder actually in the past, people close it down because they don't want a conversation. You know, what they want to do is say, oh, I've done my job. I don't want to talk to you right now. And so that becomes an opportunity for these disruptors type businesses to sort of say, well, actually, I think we can change that. So an example might be, there's a company called Lemonade, and they use conversational interfaces on their websites. It's sort of question and answer and questions, so that you can fill in a form without seeing lots of square boxes and filling it in. But they also use combination of AI and machine learning to respond to people's questions when they make claims. Sometimes those claims can be difficult. It's like, you know, because of your policy, it does not cover these aspects, and this is a difficult message. And they use some of this sort of learned behavior and structured conversations to provide a better quality of service than leave it to sort of hope that the agent on the end of the phone will pick the right word. So sometimes, you know, we forget that even in call centers, there are scripts and there are structures behind those conversations. So I think that begins to explain some examples. But certainly we're getting lots of, I mean, everyone's had deliveries, and we tend to sort of get updates again, where your order's been confirmed, it's going to arrive on this time, and it's like, hi, you know, Henry, the package is going to arrive between 9 and 10. If there's a problem, give me a shout, you know. And therefore, a lot of servers now operate with a sort of conversational sort of structure and sort of strategy to them.
Thanks, Will. No, that was brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much for a great presentation and a great Q&A. Yeah, thanks to everyone that tuned in. We'll have the recording available for you all ASAP. So yeah, keep an eye on your emails for when that pops up in your inbox. I'd like to give a quick shout out that we are hiring. We've got loads of roles available in our studio and beyond. So if you fancy working with Will, check out nemensa.com/careers for more information. We have lots of roles there as we are going through a huge period of growth, which is really exciting. Finally, our next webinar will be next year. We'll have details of that available when everyone is back from the break. Then yeah, we hope you all have a nice Christmas break and a happy new year, and we'll see you in 2022. Thank you.
Thanks very much then. Cheers then. Bye-bye.